All right, so today what we're going to be doing, and next lecture as well, we're going to be talking about something called New Imperialism, which is kind of a continuation of that earlier colonial expansion we saw during the quote unquote Age of Exploration, way back at the beginning of this course. So today we're going to look at causes, sort of generally. We're also going to look at how New Imperialism played out in Africa. All right. So we know that Europeans, motivated by a mix of sort of economic and political, and then in big air quotes there, quote unquote, ethical motives, had sought to colonize other parts of the world since the 16th century, right? Or you want to say even late 15th century, right? Columbus sailing the ocean blue in 1492 and all of that, right? Well, in the 1880s, there's another wave of colonization. We know that that first wave really focused, well, it took place in Africa and Asia, but it really focused on the Americas. In the 1880s, it's really going to shift back to Africa and Asia. And this new imperial, or we call this new imperialism, the causes are actually fairly similar to that earlier wave of colonialism that we saw again in sort of like the 16th, 17th centuries, right? So here they are. So it's nationalism and militarism, racism and social Darwinism, religious and quote unquote humanitarian motives, and then finally economic motives. So if this looks pretty similar to that whole God, gold, and glory, but kind of filtered through the 19th century, you're absolutely correct. One of the things that we're going to do as we move throughout this or the next couple of lectures is really focus on how new imperialism and then old imperialism, how they're similar, how they're different. So we're going to go through each one of those causes in turn. So, nationalism and militarism. So, again, it's kind of similar to maybe glory, but really filtered through the political context of the 19th century. So, we know that nationalism is really picking up in Europe. We see these new countries unifying. We see other countries like Britain and France also motivated by this really sort of militaristic, almost toxic nationalism. And a lot of these European countries really viewed colonies as a source of national power and prestige. It's like how many, sort of like middle-aged men collecting sports cars or something like that. It's like, how can you show off to your neighbors that you are powerful? Well, you go out and you get some colonies, right? Now, our new countries that were united by nationalist forces, Italy and Germany, because they're new countries, they're kind of late to the game. So they want to get in on what sort of the Dutch and the English and the French have been doing for a really long time. They want to gain colonies in order to gain not just standing and prestige, but also natural resources. So colonies provided natural resources, which is something we'll be talking about a little bit more as well, but they also provided ports and other military and strategic advantages that became really important as Europe was starting to gear up for war in the late 19th century, which again, really motivated by nationalism as well as other factors, which is something we'll be looking at a little bit more later in this unit as well. Now, the second cause, this is something that's definitely new to the 19th century, racism and social Darwinism. It's like, I suppose you could say sort of Europeans' conception of themselves versus people in, other parts of the world that sort of played a role in how Europeans behaved during that earlier age of exploration. But we've really seen racism kind of come into its own and take on this new kind of quasi-scientific character in the 19th century. And that was a really big motivator for new imperialism. So one of the really big beliefs that influenced how Europeans perceived people in other regions was this belief, social Darwinism, right? Which, as we know, we talked a little bit about it last unit. It's belief that, or is the belief that only the strongest races or nations can dominate and survive, and the fact that somehow it's justified if certain races dominate other ones because it's somehow naturally ordained. This is just nature. You can't argue with science. It's not science, by the way. So yeah, a lot of Europeans believed that they were genetically and biologically superior to people in Africa and people in Asia, and therefore had some kind of like biological or natural imperative to take over these regions. Again, it's pseudoscience, it's not real science, right? And Europeans put together all kinds of sort of quote unquote scientific texts to justify this, right? They kind of embrace these beliefs like phrenology, which is the study of like head shapes. You can apparently decide what civilization is superior based on how big your forehead is. And they use that to justify their colonialism and then their treatment of the people that they encountered. All right. So, cause number three, this is straight up very similar to the whole God motivation, right, that we saw with that earlier age of exploration. And this would be religious and quote unquote humanitarian motives. So, again, it's definitely the religious part, I would say, definitely not as prominent as in the earlier age of exploration. We know that Europe is kind of slowly been becoming more secular. But a lot of European, or not a lot, but there were definitely still some European missionaries who believed that they had some sort of responsibility to convert people in Africa and Asia to Christianity and impose a European way of life on them. Now, what's interesting about this and a little bit different from the earlier age of exploration is you also see some people claiming kind of like humanitarian or quote unquote ethical motives, but it wasn't really religious. So people just said, oh, we as Europeans, we are civilized, we are better than everyone else. Therefore, we have this duty to go and take care of our weaker brothers in the rest of the world. And we'll read a poem next lesson that really gets at the heart of this. It's called The White Man's Burden by Rudyard Kipling, who is British and also the author of The Jungle Book, if that is familiar to you. Now, last but not least, economic motives. So again, this is pretty similar to that whole gold motive that we saw with the age of exploration. But again, now that the economy and the way of life in Europe has changed pretty significantly, so too has this motive. So in the earlier age of exploration, well, Europeans still went to they colonized the world in search of raw materials, right? But we knew this was things like bullion, so gold and silver, spices, food, slaves. But in the 19th century, now that we've industrialized, right, they're looking for different resources. They want rubber, they want oil, they want tin, things that will help them run their factories. Now, capitalism and the development of industrial capitalism also played a role in that Europeans really colonized a lot of new places because they were looking for new markets to sell their manufactured goods. So this was actually kind of a problem they ran into in Europe. They were producing so much stuff, they couldn't actually sell it to everybody living in Europe because everyone's like, well, I don't need that much stuff. I can't afford that much stuff. So a lot of factory owners in Europe were like, well, why don't we just sell it to somewhere else, right? If Europeans won't buy it, I'm sure someone in Africa will. Right. So, speaking of Africa, let's talk specifically about how new imperialism played out there. So, we know that during the earlier age of exploration, right, Europeans did colonize parts of Africa, but it was really only the coastline. Things like disease made it so that they couldn't actually get into the interior of Africa, but that starts to change at the end of the 19th century. So, it has to do with the fact all those motives we just looked at, but also has to do with some scientific developments. We know that Europeans are getting better at combating infectious diseases, so they developed this drug called quinine, which helped combat malaria, which was one of the diseases that made it really hard for Europeans to actually get inside the interior of Africa. So that also helped facilitate the European colonization of Africa. So again, kind of connecting back to some of the developments we saw last unit as well. So just to illustrate how Africa was colonized, so in 1875, Europeans ruled 11% of Africa. By 1902, so just a few decades later, they controlled 90%. Major significant change there, right? We also call this period or this event the Scramble for Africa. And it was really sort of formalized or sort of first articulated at something called the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. So all these Europeans were sort of fighting over territory in Africa. We'll see that Britain really gets the jump on the game. Everyone starts fighting with them. And actually, our old friend Otto von Bismarck, this takes place in Berlin, right? So it makes sense that a German would be leading it. He realized that this was causing pretty significant tension between the different European nations. He hopped in, decided to play Metternich, and was like, why don't we all sit down at a conference and sort of hash this out? So at the Berlin Conference, a bunch of different European nations basically sat down and they're like, why don't we just divide Africa up like a giant pie and then everyone gets their piece of the pie? And Bismarck is like, great, fantastic. This will settle some of the diplomatic tensions. Cool, maintain the balance of power in Europe. Great, fantastic. Is it good for Africa? Absolutely not. But it is good for Europe. All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to sort of look at the different possessions of the various European countries. So really the biggest power player here is Britain. And that's because they get started early. So one of their big holdings is South Africa. And it takes them actually quite a bit of time and some warfare to get at South Africa. So what happened there? So they actually fight two wars with the Dutch over South Africa. And these are called the Boer Wars. Because the Dutch people who colonized South Africa first, they called themselves the Boers or the Afrikaners. So that's where that name comes from. So they actually got there, like, I think at the end of the 18th century, so quite a long time ago. And then during the Napoleonic Wars, the British seized this territory in South Africa called Cape Colony. And even though they didn't officially say, hey, like, we're starting a new country here, we're taking this over from the Dutch, they just kind of said, hey, British people, why don't you go move there? And British people did. The Boers were obviously not happy about this, a bunch of British people showing up in what they perceived as their land, right? And so tensions started to escalate, and they erupt into two different Boer wars at the end of the 19th century. The British actually lose the first Boer War, but they win the second one, and then they establish a territory called the Union of South Africa. Now, what's really significant about this, not only are the British sort of expanding their territory rights, but they were kind of infamously brutal, both towards the Boers, interestingly enough, as well as the indigenous African people who lived there, so the Xhosa and Zulu people of South Africa. And in fact, this is one of the first historical situations in which someone used something and they called it a concentration camp. So maybe connecting a little bit to what you're learning in English right now. So yes, German's not the first one to do that. It was the British. The British also controlled this territory called Rhodesia, which is a little bit north of South Africa, so it's in the southern half of the continent, but a little bit of North South Africa proper. And that was named after this really fervent, obsessive, kind of terrifying British imperialist named Cecil Rhodes. And if that name rings a bell to you, he is extremely popular with modern races. So yeah, lingering legacies there, huh? The British also controlled Egypt and the Sudan, and they actually competed with the French rather than the Dutch over those. So you can already see there's lots of tension between the British and various other countries as well. And you can see why Bismarck would get a little nervous about that. All right. So speaking of the rest of Africa, let's take a look. Here's our map. As we know, by sort of the beginning of the 20th century, all of or 90% of Africa is controlled by Europeans. Portugal, we remember actually they were one of the earliest power players in Africa way back in the age of exploration. They retained control of Angola and Mozambique. France colonizes much of West Africa and North Africa, so places like Algeria, Tunisia, and part of Morocco. So people from there often speak French even today. King Leopold II of Belgium colonized the Congo, and we'll actually take a closer look at him because he's a really good case study of how Europeans really did not rule Africa with any sort of humanity, despite allegedly having, these humanitarian aims. Italy gets in on the game. We know that was one of their big goals. They want to compete with all the other established European nations, right? They colonize Libya. They attempt to colonize Ethiopia, but they do not succeed. And this actually becomes a big sticking point for them, and they are going to attempt a second time a little bit later on. And then Germany, of course, our second latecomer to the imperial game. They were a lot more successful. That's, again, kind of the narrative with them. Italy unifies, and they kind of are all a big mess. Germany unifies, and they're a little bit more organized, a lot more organized. They colonized Cameroon and then territories in the Southwest and East Africa. And we know, of course, they organized the Berlin Conference, so they were pretty good at sort of manipulating this whole situation. All right. Well, now that we've talked pretty significantly about the impact on Europeans, well, what about the impact on Africa? So as we mentioned, right, there by the early 20th century, excuse me, only Ethiopia and Liberia remained independent. So most of Africa, again, is under the thumb of Europeans. Europeans did not treat their colonial holdings well at all, really highlighting that maybe economic motives played a more significant role than humanitarian aims. Europeans murdered Africans who resisted colonization, and again, we'll take a look a little bit later at the Belgian Congo, which is really one of the clearest examples of how maybe European motives were not as high-minded as they like to think they were.